Okay, well, it looks like it might be a good time for us to get started. So welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to our second annual Funding Galaxy talk. Really appreciate you all being here with us, and also a warm welcome to our panelists who are joining us as well. This is the second of these panel events that we've run, and the aim is really to delve into the early career cosmos, and we're going to be talking all about funding as an early career, mid-career researcher. How do you get it? What are some top tips? We all know we need funding, but the how is often the tricky part. So we're going to talk all about that. Before we get too far into our really interesting panel event, I just want to acknowledge traditional owners. So this beautiful picture on the slide here is called Healing from the Ground, and it's created by a First Nations artist, Dennis Golding. And we just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands, sky, and waterways on which we meet, and pay respect to elders past and present, and to all Indigenous people who may be here today. So we're meeting on Zoom, so I'm personally coming to you from Yugambeh country, and I encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands you're on in the chat if you would like to. And now I'll pass over to Ian, who's going to do our recognition of lived experience.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say the lived experience perspective that the Lions take is really something that makes us very special. And so we recognize the lived experience within the room today, and that we speak honorably and respectfully about ongoing emotional distress, about the experiences of trauma and mental ill health, and the work of caring and the experiences of care within this context. So good luck, and I hope you get your questions answered today.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that. So just a quick run through for everyone about what's happening today, what we're going to be sort of talking about. First of all, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of what the Next Generation Research Network actually is, who are the co-leads, what are we all about, things like that. Next, we're going to do an introduction for our lovely panelists and hear a bit more from them about their own journeys. We are very lucky today to also have an intergalactic panelist who was sadly unable to join us on this call, but has sent in a video. So we'll watch that. And then there will be a kind of the main event, which is a Q&A portion, which will be an opportunity for people to ask any and all questions that they might have about funding, especially as an ECR or MCR researcher. And then after that discussion, we will just close off discussing some of our upcoming plans and closing.
So whatever's the lowest is probably.
Thank you. And just a sort of timely reminder that if everyone could just keep themselves on mute while we're going through so we don't get any cross sound. All right, so I guess Next Gen Researcher Network. Who are we? What do we do? So some people will have been with us for a little while. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. But for some people, this might be new. So we just want to do a bit of an overview to let you know who we are and why we think that you should come and join us. So the Next Gen Researcher Network, it's one of the networks within the Mental Health Research Translation Centre that is alive. And the aim of it is to provide the opportunity to bring together future mental health research leaders. And it's really about capacity building support and innovative career development through things like this panel and some of the other activities that I'll talk to you about in a moment. You can see from the sort of graphic that's up on the screen, we've currently got 205 members, so we're growing steadily. And you'll have seen that Dana's popped the link to join the network in the chat as well. So we're a very sort of open, friendly network, and we're very keen to have new people on board and new perspectives as well. We've got representation around the country, but always looking to grow in some of those areas where maybe we don't have some of those states and territories where we don't have as many people. And it's all about providing a scaffold for members to lead and also be led, mentoring, training, and as well as extending the network. So actually allowing people to build up those networks that we know are so important when it comes to acquiring funding and things like that. We also have an annual networking event as well, which will be coming up next year, which is always very exciting to be able to touch base with everybody. Here's just an overview of some of our events so far. So, these are the kinds of things that we do as a network, that we encourage people to come along and join us, because the more perspectives we have, the more interesting discussions we have, and the more we all learn from one another. One of the big things is this research funding panel that we're now in the second annual of those. And something really great that came out of it last year that we will also be developing this year is an actual co-created guide. So we take all the information that's given to us by our wonderful panel based on the questions that our members ask, and put that together in a guide that then, we can all refer to throughout the year. It's not a one and done thing. It's something that we kind of keep building on and referring to. We've also hosted a number of Ready, Set, Translate talks. So they've been really interesting, ranging from topics like mental health in academia to system-wide mental health data, and also long-term housing support for people with significant mental health and wellbeing concerns. So we cover quite a range of topics. Another key thing that we've done that's really great is having the seed funding initiative. So this year's seed funding initiative closes on the 1st of September. So for anyone who's super motivated by our panel event today, there is still a little bit of time to apply for that. But we've got these kind of great events that touch on all different points with the aim of really capacity building in next gen researchers. Just a very brief intro. This is who we all are. So this is our group of co-leads. So we've got 2 investigator co-leads, Emma and Lena, and then a group of us who are the next gen co-leads. You can see us all there on the screen. And we've been going for a couple of years now. So we've got some people who've been with us for a little while, and others who have joined a little bit more recently, which has been really great to expand that group. And really importantly as well, we also have our lived experience research leads. So as the next gen research group, we work really closely with the lived experience group here at Alive as well. And so we're really grateful to have those perspectives on board with us as well. All right, so that's a little bit about who we are and the background of what we've done so far, but we're obviously here today to talk to our panelists, who are very grateful have joined us and given up their time to come along and answer all of our questions. So what we're going to do at this portion is we're going to go around one by one, ask the panelists, dob them in, ask them to introduce themselves, tell us kind of broadly what your research area is, but also a little bit about your kind of your journey or trajectory so far. So one of the things when we as co-leads were discussing, setting up this event, is we're really interested in people's stories of how they got to where they are, because it's very easy, from the outside to look at people, wow, your career is so amazing and interesting, but there's always kind of a story behind that, and we are particularly interested in those stories. So our first panelist, who I'll ask to introduce himself, is Associate Professor Gregory Armstrong from the University of Melbourne.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I've got a bit of a head cold at the moment with a bit of a burning sore throat, and I'm at home with my moccasins on and a cup of tea, and hoping my brain switches on enough to give some cogent kind of thoughts on this topic. I'm just delighted to be part of this. It's a really great initiative, and so exciting to see the other panelists as well, who I know a couple. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me to be part of this. So I'm based at the Nossal Institute for Global Health, which is in the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. I've been there around 13 years. Most of my work's in the suicide prevention space and global mental health space. So a lot of my work's in low and middle income countries, particularly in the South Asia region. I kind of had a long winding pathway to getting into academia, and I never particularly sought it out, actually, which I think has stood me in good stead in some ways, because it's quite a challenging space, obviously, to be part of. And, I've come with a different set of perspectives, perhaps. So my first degree was actually economics, and I at the end of that, I didn't particularly engage with that discipline hugely. And I went and studied social work and worked as a social worker in community mental health for a number of years, which I know sounds like a bit of a U-turn from economics. And I kept sort of studying and doing political science, social policy stuff in the background, and ended up doing a PhD in international health, and which has kind of kicked off my academic journey. But I did first come to the university on a 9-month contract and worked for several years on 1-year contracts, just like many of us, just piecing things together, working on other people's grants, and really have just sort of kicked off my own sort of research led by myself since starting PhD study and completing that. So I'm 8 years out now from PhD, and in that sort of delicate dance phase of transitioning to a mid-career researcher. There's a lot of growing pains involved in that, and some of the same challenges sort of continue, and there's a few new ones to encounter as well. I've just, in terms of my current kind of funding setup, if that's helpful to know about, I'm just commencing my second NHMIC fellowship. So it's an Emerging Leader 2 investigator grant. And I come off previously in an NHMIC early career fellowship. And I've been supported by the faculty for a year in between those as for a bridging fellowship to keep you alive, because, these things are quite tenuous, right? I also have some other NHMIC funding, but also some philanthropic funding as well. So broadening the funding base a bit, and trying to engage more with government funding at the moment. Have an application with DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. At the moment, it's my first time going in that direction, and that's an entirely different and very confusing experience, to be honest. So I'm looking forward to hearing from other panelists if they've had some experiences in that space. That kind of gives you a rough idea of where I've come from and what I'm currently up to, I think.
Great, thank you so much. I know there are definitely some things in there that we have questions about from our group, so I think we'll touch on those a bit more in a moment. Next up, if I could ask Associate Professor Carly Johnco from Macquarie University to give us a bit of an overview about yourself.
Sure. Well, hello. Thank you for having me today. So I am a clinical psychologist and associate professor at Macquarie University in the School of Psychological Sciences. And I have had I guess in terms of where I've come from and my pathway, I've had a pretty fortunate path in research, but a pretty common research only pathway. So after I did a combined master's PhD, and I worked in private practice and clinical practice for a few years. And after that, I went over to the US and did a postdoc for 2 years over there, which was a research-only postdoc. Productive. I worked very, very hard over there, but it was a productive time, and I think really set my career path up for me during that window of time. So after 2 years in the US at the University of South Florida, I came back to Macquarie University as a project postdoc, working on someone else's ARC project funding for a year before I got my first fellowship, Macquarie University Research Fellowship, during which time I had 2 small children. So that was a very interrupted but great opportunity. So I had that fellowship while I had small kids. And then I just this year transitioned onto an NHMIC Emerging Fellowship. So this is my second fellowship. During that time, I was successful in getting a continuing position to underpin my fellowships, which was a really life-changing moment to have secure employment. And that's obviously a huge source of stress as an early career researcher, is that balance between wanting career stability while also trying to progress this research pathway. So happy to answer questions about that. And in terms of my funding setup, I've had about $4.5 million worth of funding from a variety of sources. So NHMRC funding, foundation funding from Australian Rotary Club, and the International OCD Foundation over in the US. So both domestic and international foundation funding. Again, I think is a helpful thought process, not just limiting to Australian-based foundation funding, as well as small seed funding from the university and institutional funding. So really happy to talk about some of those experiences.
Great. Thank you so much, Carly. Definitely, I think in terms of, I know that there are some questions about balancing family type responsibilities and work, and also insecure work is a big theme. So we'll probably return to those. Thank you. Next up for our intros, we've got Associate Professor Miriam Forbes, who is from Macquarie University.
Hey, thanks for having me today. Yep, so I go by Miri Forbes. I'm an associate professor at Macquarie University, and it's funny hearing Carly talk about her career path because that is also my career path. We've been in step together for a lot of our academic careers, but I can tell you mine again anyway. So I did my PhD here at Macquarie, and wasn't sure that I wanted to go into academia, but during my PhD just fell in love with research and that whole experience, and so did similar steps to Carly after that. Initially I had academics here at Macquarie cobble together a postdoc for me, 3 different sets of project funding that were, 2 days on 2 and 1 day on 1. And while I was doing that work, I got a fellowship over in the States. I went to the University of Minnesota for 2 years, and much like Carly, worked incredibly hard, became quite obsessed with work. And it really was the turning point, I think, in becoming focused on research. My productivity in that time opened a lot of doors for me, and I was in the right place at the right time in terms of my network and opportunities. And then I came back to Australia, worked on the same project that Carly worked on, but only briefly until I got my MQRF fellowship funding through Macquarie. So that was a 3-year fellowship where the university mostly covers your salary, but there's also $50,000 of project funding for the duration of the fellowship. And during that fellowship, I applied for an NHMRC investigator grant and started that shortly afterwards. I also had 2 young children during those 2 fellowships, the same age as Carly's children, 2 and 5. And so now I'm halfway through my first investigator grant, and I'll plan to apply for another one next year. And in terms of my other funding experience, most of the other funding that I've had has not been closely related to my work, which I haven't talked about. My work is on statistically based, so data-driven ways of reconceptualizing the way that we diagnose and classify mental illness, mental ill health and distress. And so, yeah, my core focus has been on getting fellowships to allow me the time to do that work. And then the other funding that I've done has often been through my statistical and methodological expertise, so working with other interdisciplinary groups to help contribute to their work in other spaces. So yeah, I'm much more, I guess, focused on my fellowship work. And yeah, that's it. That's the end of my story.
Great. Thank you so much, Miri. Well, it sounds like we have a wealth of experience in terms of if anyone's keen to go over to the US, we've got, I'm sure we'd be happy to take questions about that experience. Next up for our panelists, we've got Dr. Justin Chapman from Griffith University.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today, likewise. I've had a little bit of an interesting journey for my where I've come to for my research career, I suppose. My undergraduate degree was in physics and mathematics at Griffith University. I went on to do 2 years of a PhD in experimental atomic physics, which was kind of cool. But I just actually wasn't very good at that, so had a bit of a career change. I was really into exercise at the time, so I went on to become a personal trainer and worked commercially in gyms for maybe a year or 2. And I started working in a mental health setting as a peer worker, and where I was developing some peer work exercise programs. So it was basically trying to bring different kinds of expertise together, having peer support and personal training wrapped up into one recovery-oriented program. And that was actually quite successful. I only had a part-time role there with the mental health service, but saw some really positive outcomes. And then someone suggested I do this as a PhD, and it never occurred to me to re-enter research or academia. And I certainly never had any kind of understanding of the different kind of options that there were available. In physics and mathematics, people can get very insular. There's basically nothing around you except physics, mathematics, biology, chemistry, maybe engineering. So doing it in public health never occurred to me before, but I was thrilled to get back into university and to continue study, and didn't suffer any motivational issues that I did in my previous field. And was super excited to be there, and did a PhD at the University of Queensland with the School of Human Movement and Nutrition Sciences. As I was finishing up my PhD, a few things happened. One, the research group I was with, there was a restructure in the school, and so a lot of the funding or collaborations that I thought would be around kind of fell out from underneath my feet. But also the PCYC Queensland, who I was working with before to develop the exercise programs initially, they were applying for funding from Partners in Recovery, who many may remember were within primary health networks and provided psychosocial support for people with severe mental illness. And so I jumped on board that application as the project lead, and we were successful in that. And so as I was writing up my thesis, I got to go straight out and apply those skills and learnings into real world translation. And I got into the field in the first place to try to make a real world impact and get exercise programs more available for people with mental health issues. So that was an excellent transition. But we've talked about before, and it's been noted that there is quite an unstable funding environment for research. I suppose for mental health more generally, but certainly in research, it's piecemeal funding, short-term contracts. And so for about 5 years, I had between 2 or 4 concurrent jobs at any one time, working between 4 and 6.5 days per week at any one time, depending on what funding was available and what grant I had or didn't have, or what I was trying to do. I still maintained work in community sector, so I was working with PCYC Queensland right up until a few months ago when I had to resign to move on to the next phase of this work. I was also a research officer with QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute in Brisbane. A consumer consultant, now converted into a permanent part-time lived experience research position at Metro South Addictions and Mental Health Service. So that's where I am now. Research fellow with Alive and the ITN, Implementation Translation Network, at Griffith University, and 2 days of my time at Griffith is now brought out from an MRFF grant that I've been fortunate enough to secure in the last few months. I'll wrap up, but I guess most of my funding journey has been trying to get funding from anyone who will give it to me, including across any sector. So I've secured funding from primary health networks, from philanthropy, from research organisations, from hospital and health service to support the work that I've done over these years. And it's tiring. So now that I've got a permanent part-time government job, I'm just going to put my feet up, kick back, do some paperwork for the next 10 years. No, this next grant that I've been fortunate enough to receive is going to be full on. I'm fairly behind in that because often grant funded projects take longer than you expect to finish off. One that I had recently with the Mental Health Commission took months longer than it should have. So this whole year is trying to catch up. But excited to be here and to keep talking, but I'll hand over to the next panel member.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. And yes, it's always good to hear about varied experiences. And I know sometimes as an ECR that planning your retirement is something we do. So there might be some questions about that coming up also. And now last but definitely not least for our panelists who are online today, we have Dr. Catherine Brasier, who is at La Trobe University.
So, hi everyone, it's good to see you again, Justin. I feel like our stories have a lot of vibing and crossover with that. So I'm lived experience strategic lead here at Wellways, and now occupy a full-time NGO leadership role, reporting directly to the directors, which is the highest level that we've got in our NGO for lived experience, and pretty high in general. I also have what is an adjunct research fellowship with La Trobe. And I negotiated that upon completing my postdoc, as I was moving from my postdoc straight into an industry role. So, and I guess that it's important to kind of highlight that this was my career plan. Sometimes we see going to NGO, industry or government as dropping out or falling out or as being less prestigious than being an academic. It was very much my plan. So prior to becoming unwell, I had previously completed a Bachelor of Arts. So I already had a scholarly record, and I was showing really great potential around conceptual and theoretical kind of constructs and understanding and dissecting things like text. So the thing that I have brought forward with me into my career from that phase of my education was a firm understanding and use of things around post-structuralism. And it's funny now in the current work that I do that what I'm most often requested to do by psychiatrists is actually work around how the language and meaning shifts with culture and how we construct things. So that ties into how we construct things like diagnosis or phrases like lived experience, consumer, and how those things can shift and change. About to have an article out in Australasian Psychiatry, around the way that recovery and rehabilitation's meaning has shifted and changed, and who and how that has changed over time from the consumer movement through the medical models. So that's very, very much true to what I do. After becoming unwell, I decided to make a career shift for my own existential benefit and necessity, and I fell into doing social work as a direct experience for receiving support and witnessing occupations that I had no previous kind of experience in witnessing or seeing. I decided that I liked the idea of doing what my worker did, which is driving around in a car and then taking people out for coffee. And I thought that at the age of 23, that sounded like a job that I would be good at and I'd like. So I shifted into doing I first did my Cert 4 in AOD counselling, which was kind of how I got into this mess to start off with. From that, after the Cert 4, I had a choice about where to continue my tertiary education instead of going on to do a diploma in AOD, which would be limiting in terms of career prospects. So I'd just be in AOD. I decided to do social work because I knew if I kind of timed out in one area, I'd be able to go into a different part of social work. And a bit like being a nurse, there's just always tons of social work jobs as well. And that was a really important thing for me to think about, and that you can have social workers everywhere. So I worked as a social worker for mind and community mental health in another similar NGO to where I am now for nearly 10 years. I left at the end of at the start of a Royal Commission because of the way that it impacted on services and my imminent safety, as I was working in adult residential care, which had a really long history of assaults on staff. So my backup plan for that was to take my honours score and try and get a PhD. My honours scores was radically impacted by my experiences of disability because I also have MS and have had extreme disability experiences and prolonged ones because of that. Nonetheless, I was able to find someone who had $2.7 million as a project funding, and I piggybacked on them, and they really, really needed a PhD. And they were having trouble finding people, so I was able to kind of wiggle my way in there. So it's a good reminder for us as lived experience people that there's more than one way to enter into a PhD, and that our previous marks and scores aren't always deterministic. There's nothing like a bit old razzle-dazzle to get you through the door. The reason I picked that project, aside from knowing that they were going to be able to afford me and cover my costs and give me a scholarship and pay for my fees, was because I knew that it was going to be a large group of professors mostly who were going to have to help me. And I was going to need help because I was doing something that we don't usually do in lived experience or in social work, which was to run a randomised control trial. So my randomised control trial at its completion had 173 participants over 4 points and 14 measures. So that is a non-typical lived experience area for us to go into, and same for social work. Coming out of that, I got a job with Professor Lisa Brophy in the University of Melbourne in the Pearson EDs project. On completion of that, when all of my PhD being conferred in that, I completed my postdoc with her at La Trobe when she moved there. And towards the end of the postdoc, I was really looking to do what I intended to do, which was to come back to NGO space and be able to use my research and experience skills in a more practical and applicable way. And that's my story.
Thank you so much, Catherine. very valuable to have that lived experience perspective, and also a reminder that academic work in a university is not always your only option or valuable contribution. So I think we'll talk about that a bit more in the Q&A bit. So next up, we have our intergalactic panelists, who, as I mentioned at the start, has coming to us via video. So this is a video from Dr. Lou Farah, who works at ANU.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me join you today virtually. My name is Dr. Lou Farah, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Mental Health Research at the Australian National University. I'd like to spend a little bit of time today just talking about my own path through research and some of the things I've learned along the way, applying for lots of grants, not getting lots of grants, and having a few successes as well. I've had some time away from the workforce, so I received my PhD in 2011, and in that time I've had caring responsibilities and also have done some clinical work as a psychologist that complements my research work quite well, but also means that my track record may not look the same as other people's who are the same distance or time out from their PhD as I am. In terms of grant funding, since I received my PhD in 2011, every single year I have applied for major fellowships, major grant project funding. I've applied for funding from both the two major funding bodies in Australia and also a range of different philanthropic, national and international organisations as well. And for me, what has tended to happen or work over time is that persistence is key. It took me 8 years to get my first major grant break, and that was a fellowship from the ARC in 2019. And when I reflect on what the sort of the magic combination seemed to be, I suppose, for that grant success, was that I feel like it was a situation of being the right person with the right idea at the right time. And so because I had been applying for so many years and had found it so difficult to be able to get some success with my grant applications, my confidence was eroded. I felt that maybe I didn't have the right track record, or perhaps I wasn't the right person to be able to obtain grant funding. But as it turns out, with that particular application, I was able to develop and write about a project that was timely, that was relevant to the funding body's needs and priorities at the time. And I was also able to really articulate strongly how I was the right person to do that research as well. Since then, a couple of other things that I've learned are about really trying to understand well what the needs and priorities of the funding body are that you're applying for. And for me, that's having to go beyond what the grant guidelines are or what the funding rules are, and to also talk to a lot of colleagues, talk to people who have anecdotal experience or other experiences in applying for funding from different granting bodies, to try and understand the fit between your ideas and your project and the needs and priorities of the grant funder. I know now that there are projects that I'm very interested in that I know I want to get funded, but I know are just not likely to be attractive to certain funding bodies. And so it's really important that I understand that fit and how it works to be able to appropriately target my research and my project ideas to particular funding bodies. Another thing that I've learned as well is that when building collaborations, or if you're wanting to work in teams with projects and apply for grant funding, is that sometimes small beginnings can pay off down track. And what I mean by that is that when I put together teams for projects that I want to seek funding for, or I'd like to be involved in other people's funding applications, some of these invitations have come from conversations, very small conversations I may have had with someone, or someone I may have met at a conference sort of 2 years ago, or someone I may have met through networking or through another colleague, or this just might be very small kind of conversations I may have had with someone who I met who might have aligned interests, or somebody who might be thinking about the same sorts of ideas. And so sometimes it can take years, but these connections and relationships that you build can actually pay off down track in terms of being, building collaborations and being involved in other people's projects and having them involved in your projects as well, particularly in terms of funding applications. The final thing I wanted to talk about was track record and CV building. I feel like I spent a lot of time in my career looking at my track record and my CV and thinking, oh, you know, I could be better. I could have more publications. I need more grant funding or more prizes or things like that. And all of those things are important. Of course, you should look at it and sort of try and target gaps or areas of development where you think you probably might need more. But more important than that, I think, is about understanding what different funding bodies are looking for in a track record. Some funding bodies might be really convinced by number of publications or impact of publications or grant funding. Others might be more interested in your mentoring skills, your international standing or collaborations and things like that. So just trying to think about, you know, how you talk about your track record and talk about yourself in your CV and really making sure that it's about fit. And finally, understanding that granting bodies, their priorities and what they're looking for in a track record can also change too. So just being aware of those changes and being able to maintain that level of fit whenever you're applying for applications for grants or fellowships. For example. So that's pretty much it for me. Thank you so much for having me. There's probably much more that I could share, but if you do have any questions or you ever want to touch base and connect just to have a talk about anything that I've spoken about today, please feel free to send me an email. Thanks so much. Bye.
Well, thank you so much to Lou for that video that she submitted in. Now I'm going to hand over to Amy and Beck, who are going to facilitate the next part, which is the Q&A.
Thanks, Kaylee, and thanks so much, panelists, for being here today. I have so many questions that I want to ask, but I will start, I think, from the early stages. We're going back to late stage PhD and early career researcher. Question will start off there first, and I think there might be a link to the Slido where you can ask your own questions. Yeah, thanks, Dana. So, but to get us started, panelists, yeah, so thinking about those late stage stages of the PhD or the early stages of being an ECR and looking to what comes next. This question's a bit of a double-barrel one, so bear with me. So thinking what tips do you have for how you would build a track record with minimal resources, and or if you wanted to continue the work that you're passionate about in your PhD or other things that you've found along the way, or if an opportunity to be on a grant hasn't presented itself, how would you go about finding a team and where would you sit on that application, and any tips around that? I'll hand over to you if anyone's got any burning thoughts on that.
I'm happy to start because I think this is something I can contribute to. Secondary data analysis, I think, is a really key thing when you don't have resources, and that's what most of my career is built on. That I didn't get my first set of funding until, I don't know, at least a couple of years post PhD, and then you don't really have job security and you're working on other people's projects. And so to keep your own ideas chipping along, to be able to find existing data and do analyses that answer your questions, kind of that approach. There's so much open data now, and that would be what I would recommend as a key opportunity from that perspective.
Can I just add to that for something that's more context specific, something that I often really encourage, that I'm aware that that we're speaking about doing secondary analysis, but in lived experience, we avoid quantitative, like the plague. So at the capacity for lived experience researchers to undertake secondary analysis is of our own choosing, something we're not likely to do. I know that I often use the phrase that just because we haven't conquered it doesn't mean it's not ours. What I encourage all ERCs and PhDs to do is to find areas of commercial niche where they are going to be employable and their skills are going to be usable. So one of those spaces is in quantitative and analysis and technical fields, and it's the space that we're currently choosing not to occupy and develop expertise in. So it's a great area of opportunity that we've linked in there. Thanks, Miriam.
I might chime in as well. I mean, I've kind of done a bit of both on the qualitative and quantitative without using a lot of resources, really. I think for most of us, probably those early years are really forged off not having many resources, and probably one of the key aspects of any kind of research career is learning to work collaboratively and part of a team. And that can be a local team or forging a team internationally even, or you know, people have similar passions and interests and who you enjoy working with. And if you can form those kinds of alliances, you find ways to get access to data or to participate in other people's projects in other ways, or perhaps employed on someone else's grant, which is what I did for a couple of years, while trying to establish myself and my own ideas before applying for a fellowship of my own. Yeah, it's a journey. The PhD is a really key part of it, but I do think that the next couple of years is still a really key learning. I mean, it's all learning opportunity, isn't it? But really, it felt like I was still had a lot to learn at the end of my PhD. Others may feel differently. So it really helped to have a supervisor who I think I just hit gold really with a supervisor whose door was always open and who had experience with getting an HMRC funding. And I knew nothing about that kind of stuff previously, and felt like it was a closed door to me. And why would anyone like me, particularly a social worker, even get access to that kind of funding? And so just having someone like that who was willing to guide me and back me with my ideas was really made it, I think, for me, really.
I had similar experiences to some people, and I acknowledge to Catherine that these comments really depend on the type of area that you're working in. But I also did quite a lot of secondary data analysis. I worked for free a lot. That's not inspiring advice, but that's the reality of what a lot of us do is, I guess those early years, that kind of like late PhD and the early ECR phase, you're trying to get known to people, and you're trying to develop those relationships and work out where you might be able to collaborate, where you might not be able to collaborate. And one of the things that I think blew my mind in that late PhD stage and early ECR phase was that it's okay to ask if there's scope to collaborate with people. That felt incredibly daunting, and I think I had some senior people who helped facilitate that in the early days. But I think making that enthusiasm and that interest known to the senior people that you work with, when you meet people at conferences, if they're talking about interesting projects, it is okay to say, if there's scope to collaborate on that, I'd be really interested, or, is there any way that I'd be able to help out with those sorts of ideas? And I think that had felt quite taboo when I was starting out, but I was quite shocked at how receptive people were. And my early, I had 2 postdoc offers internationally straight out of my PhD, and it was from reaching out to these people and asking, which, yeah, it was just not something that I had heard talked about much. But people often have data lying around that they won't have time to analyse and are really enthusiastic for people to take initiative or their efforts. So I would share that with everyone.
I wonder if this raises interesting thoughts for the panel to consider around something that we learn a lot in academia around defining a market niche. And I wonder if some of our lived experience panelists, just for me to be a bit cheeky, have thoughts and feelings around how our niche is actually now being lived experience, and how that has market imperative and value, and how that might be used well and misused. So, for example, do MRFF assessments, looking at the investigators, whether they are a CI and AI, whether or not they're contributing to the methodology, the understanding or the description of the research problem, how participants are being taught, and whether or not our lived experience researchers who are coming onto grants and projects to fill that lived experience niche are being well supported and are then having meaningful opportunities to contribute and develop their own track record. Does anyone have thoughts on experiences with that? I'm just curious.
If you don't mind, I might just jump in there as well, Catherine, because it's a great point. And we do actually have a question that is similar and something that we've been wondering, I think, is how you, as you said, how you meaningfully include people with lived experience, but also how do you include lived experience researchers that are very new to research, have only just been introduced and don't have a track record as well. At this point, lived experience research is kind of emerging, and we can't just have only those 20 people on every single grant in the country. So yeah, I think that's a really great point. And Beck, if you don't mind, I think if we can get the panelists to ask that question, and then we'll move on.
I had some thoughts, unless others wanted to go in. But I mean, I was sort of listening to that and reflecting a bit on what I hear people who might be Indigenous and being asked to be on grants, or even people who are statisticians and being asked to be on grants. There's a variety of different categories, or different dynamics, obviously, and all of that. But I think it's a really important point, because at a certain stage you can end up with a whole lot of grant funding on your CV, but you're not leading any of it, and it's all across a whole broad range of things, and sometimes the ethics and philosophy behind it you might not even agree with after a little while, once you sit back and realize that, oh, I jumped at that because I wanted to build my track record. So trying, it's not obviously none of this is easy, but I guess those of us who are in positions of asking others to join our grants in those kinds of roles need to be really mindful of how to provide opportunities within the grant for them to lead something, to lead a piece of it, and to even adjust a piece of it that really fits with something that they want to do or how they want to do it. So providing opportunities for that leadership, but is one thing that we can be doing a bit better, I think, for those of us leading those grants, and bringing people in earlier so that conversation can happen, rather than the grant submitted in 2 weeks, can I put your name down? So anyway, some of those are the realities that sometimes hard to navigate around, but I think we can all continue to do a bit better on that.
I think I would echo what Greg said, the idea of doing it early. That's how you can do it meaningfully, right? To invite people early in the process so that they can have meaningful input in shaping the grant and the ideas and the direction that you're going in as a team, and not doing it in that tokenistic way of, oh crap, we're submitting in 2 weeks and we need to find a lived experience person. I think it's about foresight and planning, and really consciously, meaningfully incorporating that work from the outset.
So in the work that I do, I often talk about where should consumers or community members be involved in a research project. And really, if we're to look at it in the most explicit way, they should be in the defining and the identifying of the research project. So I always am a little bit cheeky in reminding researchers, actually, if you've defined the problem and then you're bringing people in, you're probably asking the wrong questions anyway. Where I see people get really stuck is that they actually don't know people who are most impacted by what they're studying, and they don't have any social, community, or professional connections to them. So their ability to understand even what the problems are, or whether or not certain measures or approaches would even be able to give you an appropriate answer, is usually not well understood. And that's actually something that we can do as a lived experience community, and to help other people understand what the problems are that we would like solved.
Thank you. Justin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think just building on some of those points that have already been raised, ensuring that people with lived experience that you do get on your grant applications or in your subsequent project do have an active role in the project moving forward. So I was involved in a recent tender project where I was co-leading, but we had also a lived experience advisory panel. And I think at the end, there were a lot of unhappy people, because as an advisory panel, you can feel like your voice isn't actually heard or considered that well. You've got a core group of researchers who listen to you, but in the end, they've got to make the decision separately. So I think ensuring that there are funded roles for people so that they can contribute meaningfully throughout, even though we did end up asking them to come and contribute to key components of the project, that tended to be reactive, and so that also unsettled people a bit as well. Whereas if people had an understanding of what they were doing and what their role was going to be and how they can contribute meaningfully, it would have made it all go a lot more smoothly. In MRFF panels at the moment, and Catherine will be very familiar as well, who contributes to these panel reviews, but it's very much a developing criteria, I suppose, of grants to have community and lived experience involvement. And over time, you'll be able to see the strategies that people try to come up with and scramble to come up with to try and get the funding. But over time, it'll become more sophisticated. I think at the moment, the last panel that I was on, Catherine was there as well. I don't think that's breaching any confidentiality at the moment. That panel's well and truly closed. But having a panel advisory group was one of those common things. You can review the grant and go, okay, they've got a lived experience panel. There's one tick. But then there were some who had a bit more genuine engagement from the beginning all the way through, and a variety of strategies.
And I'll just add that the strength of that panel that could be replicated was that they had consumers who had technical expertise in the area and in the methods that they were commenting on. So there wasn't that sense that it just got through because they were bewildered, because I'm able to say the participant group that you've picked is not going to be able to answer that question, or if there's an inherent bias in this method. And we were able to offer that as part of commentary. So that was something that I thought did really, really well. One of the things that I'll add to that is, so I come more from an enterprise space. I'm a very fingers in pies person, as you can tell. But I also come from a consulting background. And, you know, my consulting practices is what paid for my house deposit. It wasn't research or my postdoc, it was consulting stuff. So there's similar avenues and practices that we can think about for other people who might not want to be in a research space, but might function very well in a tender or a consulting space as well, that's a little bit connected. Whether you're from research or from consulting or whatever, it is still understanding the strengths that you can bring that have a market value. And those are things that can connect you in for your track record and your future partners, and to be very careful about your future partners. Yeah, I've always had great ones, but my PhD was in a university that was incredibly predatory and just got RAs and didn't put them on grants and worked them to the bone, and then they all died and went and did other things that weren't connected to their PhD. So you have to be incredibly careful.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear about your experience in that, Catherine.
Mine was fine, but we did get in the Herald Sun, our institute. That was fabulous.
Okay.
Yeah.
A story for another day for sure. I guess Justin and Catherine, you've both touched on this word tender, and I'm very, very new to this kind of, I suppose, looking at these kind of different ways of obtaining funding. So would someone on the panel like to begin? But I guess, how can you find out more about these tenders, contracts, consulting kind of work? How do you kind of
tenders.vic.gov.au. You just register. tenders.vic.gov.au is for your bigger tenders. The way that I got all of my consulting jobs were through people I knew through my professional network who are interested in having lived experience-led products. And then it's been through my professional networks and through handed on stuff that I've got my most significant consulting projects. Yeah. And your tenders, you can still go for tenders and process through as part of your university role, and you can also go for consulting projects and have them come in as part of your earned income as well. That the university takes a chunk. Whereas if you do them independently, you are the receiver of the full and entire amount that you invoice for.
Yeah, so obviously online, there's a number of ways, and I think Tender Link is another one. That one might be a bit more nationally focused. But being involved with organisations is probably the main one. If you're with a university or a community organisation, they're actively looking for funding as well. And if they're proactive in getting that funding, they'll be putting newsletters or emails out through your academic or staff networks to say this funding's available. Who wants to try to apply? When I was at QIMR, there was something called SPIN. SPIN, it's a international funding database, but organisations have to pay for membership for that. So most universities would probably have some kind of access to other databases like that as well.
It's also worth mentioning your grants, your university grants department. I've become friends with them. It's their job to do that.
In terms of other, I guess, non-tender based systems to check for grant opportunities, things like Grant Connect and Research Professional or other database systems. You can put in keywords that will screen for opportunities and send them through. But yeah, research officers, institutional research officers are also really helpful if they get to know you and your particular area and scale of funding that you're likely to be looking for. They're quite good at sending out those pots of money as well, or the philanthropic or foundation kind of funding opportunities.
Some of my best funding and income opportunities come from the fact that I sit at the intersection from lived experience, research and delivery and design, because each of those groups all work in a completely solid way, but we all completely need each other. So what I see most in grant applications is that people aren't partnering with organisations who are invested in solving the questions and would be able to recruit people. So often I see a lot of also into peer review, quite meaningless research coming out. And then on the other side, consumers want questions answered, and neither delivery and design are doing it, or researchers are interested in looking at that at all. So we actually all need to work together. And my best opportunities have come through my network, where I'm able to join and bring different people from across those sections together to do very successful projects.
Right. Anyone else have any other pressing things about tenders and the like?
I'll just add in the chat as well. I think Julia's just mentioned another one, the Sachs Institute as well, if you want to look in the chat for some more resources there.
And maybe I'll just mention, particularly if you're in the translational implementation side, look up your local council. Form an organisational partnership for some kind of program or support program that you want to be able to trial and evaluate. There's a lot of different funding sources around. It doesn't have to just be research focused, and then you embed evaluation in that, and you can take that next step and say you've got this pilot data that allows you to show that you're capable of delivering this program or whatever it is, and then you can go up to the next level of funding.
And your peak bodies as well. Often peak bodies get left out, but are really great at helping support you with recruitment, often with places to hold focus groups and interviews, and to help you guide whether or not what you're asking is appropriate or comfortable for those people to answer.
Greg, did you have something to add, or you're just thinking?
Yeah, no, I haven't. As I said in my sort of intro, I haven't really done a lot in that space with the only tiny fractional little bits and pieces of other people's things that they've brought in. So, but I do know there's plenty of people in my school, which is almost entirely sort of soft funded, really. There's a little bit of teaching through the Master of Public Health, but everyone's sort of bringing in either research funding or contract and grant consultancy funding. And yeah, a lot of people have made their careers off this consultancy and contract funding, and some incredibly well-known people who have managed to balance both getting, some research and HMRC funding as well as that other kinds of funding, and sort of have a balanced career. So it is wise to have a balance because there's going to be dry periods in either side. What I've kind of learned just from their experiences more so than my own, so I've sort of been hesitant to speak, has just been more around the value of building relationships. And it's probably the days of being the researcher sitting in an office and plugging away at the stuff that you're interested in and leaving that as the start and end of it, is that they're well and truly gone. So whether we're talking about lived experience engagement or whether we're talking about different kinds of funders, whatever, it's all about getting out there and building relationships and becoming known. But doing it in a way, I mean, it's how you do that that's also really important. It's doing it sort of genuinely and meaningfully and authentically. It's easy to say, but when you're struggling to get funding and you're desperate to keep the salary going, and there's a bit of research survivalism or academic survivalism going on in the background, it can kind of interfere in the way you construct those relationships. So of course, everyone's going to be strategic. The funder's going to be strategic too. There's nothing wrong with being strategic, but it is about being meaningful, building meaningful relationships and being authentic.
Yeah, great point. Thank you so much. Moving to, I suppose, somewhat the other side of grants now. So Lou touched on feeling like she was not attractive to some funding bodies. So if anyone has any tips on how we sort of build awareness around what that means and how to get around that, but also how do you stay hopeful and persistent when you've got gaps in your resume or you're been unsuccessful in funding. And Carly, if you don't mind, given your background in psychology, maybe you have some additional tips. I might start with you, if you don't mind.
I think people are really open about their successes and they're not very open about their failures. And I think something that is shifting in a lot of workplaces, but maybe not all, is people sharing much more openly their unsuccessful applications and normalising that. The typical cycle is that grants are going in multiple times. They're getting rejected. They're getting tweaked or they're being updated, hopefully based on feedback, but not always. They're going into multiple different places, and this is a normal part of academia. It's not a particularly nice career path, and I think sometimes coming in from being a PhD student, we can be quite idealistic and assume that this is going to be a really smooth and supportive pathway, and it's a pretty brutal career path, particularly when you're in soft funding cycles and you've got potential. I personally always felt really lucky to have a fallback plan as a clinician, so I always was able to rationalise, it's not, and it's not just being a clinician actually as a background. I think the skill sets that we develop as researchers are desirable in a range of different types of jobs, and so I think having much more normalised conversations around the different career pathways, the different job opportunities, whether it's industry or academia or working as project funding. So sorry, someone just asked about soft funding. That's when you're working on the fixed term contract. So you might have salary cover for a particular time period, and then you're scavenging for your next grant or your next salary support. And then there's lots of people who end up with project funding with no salary support. It is a really challenging career path, and I think acknowledging that and being open about that is really important for people who are working with. Your first, a bit like submitting papers, your first rejection really hurt and you have to go and lick your wounds for a few days, and then you will have to come back. And the chances are, if you've survived to the end of a PhD, you've already had to do that. You've had a supervisor who's giving you brutal feedback when you're writing or your application or your ideas, and it's hard, but it does get easier. I have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rejections in my career so far. They don't hurt nearly as much as they do now. If I get a rejection for a paper, I go, great, where's it going next? The grant successes, I've had a lot of failures. They still hurt a bit more, but I think they hurt less than they did in the early days. So I think acknowledging that this is part of the course, this is part of our job. It's okay if you need to take a minute and lick your wounds and reflect yourself again, and then you will need to work out what is the next step. And I've had lots of really successful colleagues who've gone on to get, fantastic NHMRC, MRFF, big Category 1 funding grants, and it's the 6th or 7th or 8th time that grant is going in. So I think just being really mindful about that social comparison. It's really easy to look around you and everyone else is succeeding and getting all these accolades, and you probably don't know the failures that go behind this. So Miriam has laughed at me over the years, but I keep a failure list as well as my success list. And I think it is really normalising, and I'm really happy to show people and the early career researchers in mentoring things. This is not, the successes are much, much smaller than the failures, and that is part of our job.
Can I offer a counter perspective? Carly has a very comprehensive list of failures that she keeps, which I think that's helpful to show to other people, to say, look at what's behind all of her windowsill covered in awards and stuff like that. It really humanizes her as a colleague, for example. But the one thing that I do that really helps with persistence and rejection is I keep not a list of just the successes that go on your CV, but a thing that I have called positives, which is just like nice stuff that happens, like emails that you get that brighten your day, or feedback that a student gives you, or something that you felt you could contribute, or whatever it is. And I open up my little file and add it in. And then when you're in that stage of like, this sucks, like, oh man, I've had so many failures or so many rejections in a row, or you're just whatever it is, it really helps with the RATs, I think, to be able to reflect on that, and you can read through it and go, oh yeah, I remember, it'll come back, I'll get back to those positive things again. And so I guess that it's kind of like the flip side of, you're right, there's so much failure behind it, but also being able to remember and see the successes that aren't just the huge wins. They're not just the big grants or, you know, headline papers or whatever it is. It's like there's a lot of little stuff that can brighten it up along the way. I wanted to add one other thing, because I think that Lou really highlighted important points in her video around the fit and the alignment idea, where she was saying she wasn't attractive to these funding agencies. I think that that's one way of seeing it, but the other way of seeing it is it was a misalignment, right? Her strengths weren't aligned with the focus of the scheme. And I think that she's right that asking people can be really helpful, talking to mentors and talking to people, particularly who have had experience with a grant opportunity you're interested in. But the other piece of it, I think, is reading the grant guidelines, because, you know, listen to the grants when they tell you what they want. If they say that they want someone who has a really strong track or team with lived experience, then that needs to be what you bring to it. But if they say they want someone who has hundreds of publications, I think that it's just worth listening right from the outset, because it can help you to be selective and to fail early, to not put energy into a scheme that you were never well suited to in the first instance. That's a big thing that I use in deciding what to apply for, is, does my idea fit? Am I the right person for the scheme? And if it doesn't, it's unlikely to be worth the effort that you put into it, in my view. But other people suggest that you go for everything and see what sticks, and that can work for some people too.
So at the moment, individuals who have a combination of lived experience, technical expertise, and even the beginnings of a track record have a huge competitive advantage in this market, because at the moment there's still only those few of us who have emerged and completed PhDs and gone on to have a track record. So one of the things that I want to recognise in talking about this is that if we are to be the ones that determine our evidence base for mental health, we actually need people to not just start PhDs, but to complete them, have them conferred, and go on to develop meaningful track records that can be awarded NHMRC and MRFF grants. We are in a completely competitive space, but it is the responsibility is on us to kind of meet the rest of the market requirements in order to win. I don't think that's something that I hear talked about from a strategic position, from a lived experience culture space often enough, that actually at the moment there is huge opportunity and for us to think about how we want to make the most of what's available at the moment.
I was just reflecting on the conversation about sort of rejections, and it does feel a bit like a sad state of affairs, that we might get to a point where we feel like we failed if we haven't got a piece of funding. So with a recent thing, I submitted, the success rates were around 8% or something, or 9%, something like that. And pretty much everyone who submitted had something pretty amazing to share. And so I kind of had to shift my perspective a bit to start to have my barometer that I was going to be I wanted to be really proud of what I submitted. So, and I knew there were times when I wasn't, but just trying to think, am I achieving that? That's my success barometer. And not so much whether it happens to get funded or not, because not everyone's going to get funded. It's a funnel of great ideas that get whittled down, and there are a range of things that come into play as to how your idea may or may not get funded, and a lot of other great people submitting things. So it is very tricky to kind of perceive it as necessarily a failure. Not necessarily wanting to go too far down the pathway of everyone gets a gold star because you had a crack. But in a sense, if you did have a crack, it was quite a few months of work. So it's good to kind of hold on to a level of perspective about this is an achievement to even just submit something for some of these schemes. And if you've managed to hold on to your ethics and principles and your passions while doing it, well, Jesus, I'll give you a gold star for sure. That's pretty amazing. And I guess holding on to perspective for me is important around, probably because I never really necessarily sought out an academic career, and there's lots of other good things I could be doing with my life, and probably I often think that some of the best impacts I could have might be actually outside academia in the future. I'm not sure that I'm wedded to thinking that academia is the only way to use my academic training. I think we have a lot of PhD students coming through, and there's only so many academic positions. So realistically, the conversation has to be a lot broader about this as a training ground, so that people working in all sorts of variety of different places in industry and government, etc., bringing academic skills and ways of thinking into what they do, which will lift the game for everyone. So there's broader ways to be thinking of it, rather than I failed because I didn't get a fellowship, I think, or I didn't get a grant. I don't know. I think I've had to shift perspective. I still get anxious with grants, of course, but just it's only natural. And I've had plenty of way more, like everyone, way more failures. I use the word failure as well. So fallen straight back into the trap I've just tried to talk myself out of. But I certainly had way more things that I submitted that didn't get funded than I have had funded, and that's just part of the process. So probably each academic is a story of resilience and persistence, I would suspect.
May I add another layer that I'm not hearing from our non-identified academics that I'd like to add in from a lived experience perspective, that in addition to the wounds and the batterings of rejections and time wasted that you might not get paid for in writing your grants for days and days and weeks on end, is that the research that people with lived experience often do often connects to an even deeper social commitment and personal experience that has an added layer of meaning and poignancy for those individuals. So in addition to just getting that nasty rejection letter, we might experience this and genuinely so as a lost opportunity for making a really big practical difference in other people's lives. So I just wanted to recognise that just inherently in our lived experience academic positions, there is an added layer of meaning and loss sometimes when we don't get these things, especially if it's like lived experience led grants that then go to someone who's CI non-designated and the one little lived experience identified person's at the bottom, and how that's so nullifying. So I just want to recognise that extra level of investment we often have in lived experience. And in addition to all the great wounding stories that have been shared, which is so true. And yes, you totally don't care by the time you get the 5th rejection letter for your 5th publication. First one hurts.
Catherine, thanks for finishing. Thanks all the panelists for answering that last question. This one on Slido has been uploaded quite a number of times, so I think there's quite a lot of interest in it. How can you get funding you can use for your salary specifically?
I might as well start. So there are some salary specific schemes, like basically generally called fellowships or investigator grants. If you're going toward an HMRC level, they're the kind of 9% level success rate grants, because it funds you for a period of time. I think, what is it, 3, 4 years, 5 years. Plus these ones now, they give you research funding on top of it, so you actually have some capacity to do some research. In terms of whenever I've been able to fund myself, it's been by carving out a tiny piece of each project grant and then adding them all together to this Frankenstein's monster of a career. Yeah, one day here or a day there, half a day there, for a period of time. You can always do things like that, or shack up with someone who also has project work they want you to do.
There are some kind of industry specific kind of fellowships as well, which are good to keep in mind. So in the suicide prevention field, we have Suicide Prevention Australia having postdoctoral fellowships. The American Foundation of Suicide Prevention has a postdoctoral fellowship as well, which we can apply for from anywhere in the world. So some of those ones, whilst they're also still really highly competitive, they're just fractionally a little bit more accessible typically than some of the ARC or HMRC schemes. It can be kind of that part of that stepping stone journey. So it's good to think about targeting some of those. And yeah, other than that, I mean, as I said previously, my experience was more jumping onto someone else's grant for a few years, learning the craft a little bit more and waiting for the opportunity to strike and see if I could get lucky at getting my own one. Yeah.
I think this is a really good reminder of how uniquely structured university roles are. So we often think about them in terms of that tenure kind of model, which basically does not exist in Australia. It's more like running a milk bar. So it's really good to talk to other people who are working in universities to find out what that stuff looks like and whether or not that's a good fit for people. I know for myself, as having a disability, I knew that I was never going to be a professor, because as I got incrementally further away from my postdoc, these demands and pressures were going to increase and exceed what I would be comfortable with balancing. I think that that's relevant and important to consider for lots of people who have lived experience as well, because it's pretty merciless and it's really unstable. The way that I see other people do this most commonly is through a split role, which is through teaching with a research proportion to it. But it is actually very rare that universities that I've experienced have had full-on research-only roles, and mine was a part of a startup package when the discipline lead joined the social work department. So it's pretty fair.
Maybe just adding on, so I agree with those comments around, there's the big ticket fellowships and investigator grants, and then foundation funding. Again, becoming aware of what organisations offer those are really tricky. So again, good to reach out to senior colleagues, and people are often quite generous with their time. If you ask them, would you mind meeting for a coffee or a big Zoom chat? I've got some particular mentoring questions. And it actually, again, it seems like it will be an imposition for a lot of senior academics, but I've been quite surprised at how generous people are with their time. And sometimes it's a little bit of an ego thing for them. It's like, I value your opinion and I'm after your wisdom. And people are often much more willing to offer their time and advice than you sometimes expect at that PhD or ECR stage. One thing to add to people is that there are lots of different postdoc roles on other people's grant projects, but those roles are not all created equal. So if you are applying for those jobs or interested in them, it's really relevant to be asking questions around the balance within that role and that lead investigators' philosophy and perspective around postdoctoral level. So would you be supported in terms of running your own independent research program alongside the project demands, encouraged to publish papers, how far outside of the scope of that grant funding to go, and getting some philosophical perspectives from someone. Some of those roles really will expect you only to do the project coordination, the role that you are funded on. That will be really limiting in terms of career progression and then your competitiveness for some of those future schemes. So I think knowing at the outset what type of postdoc role you're going into can be really important, especially in those early ECR years where your clock is starting to tick.
Can I just add to that as well, from a lived experience point of view, is to get their expectations around timelines over overtime and weekend work, because that can be the crusher. And with some of these things, you only get a gold star if you complete things, like publications and projects, and that if you burn out two-thirds of the way through, it could be a bad investment. Thank you for sharing that.
I mean, I'll comment on work-life balance if we're going to head in that direction, but it's certainly something that early on was really clear to me that I didn't really want to just hang on to the job for the sake of it, really. So I have a young family, and that was kind of always going to be my top priority. Maybe, I don't know if you relate, Catherine, but also coming out of this from as a social worker, you kind of have had all these other experiences and people you've met and different perspectives you've got, and you are kind of acutely aware of your privilege and your opportunity to share your story and your thoughts and all the rest of it, and keeping in perspective that may only be for a certain amount of time, and all the rest is okay with me personally. And we've got to share around the privilege and the opportunities. but yeah, the work-life balance was just, so I guess I've kind of opted, I've seen people go different directions. Some will apply for absolutely everything and will just go, will never say no. And that's been their way to cope, and they have coped somehow. But sometimes, I mean, I could never say there's direct correlation, but sometimes it feels like it's had quite a significant personal impact on relationships and things like that. And so I kind of, yeah, I felt like I have always been quite clear in my head where my priorities are at, and generally I won't do after hours and weekend work. I know that sounds ridiculous to say. A lot of people might want to shoot me and say, how do you do that? But I will if there's a deadline, and I have absolutely no, and it's a rare thing, but it won't be an ongoing thing. And if it became to a point where I had to do that, I would probably want to get out. I don't know that that's going to be sustainable for me personally and my own mental health. And being able to come home and being a good parent as well.
Thanks, Gregory, because I think once you're in universities, this kind of like masochism of overtime and deadlines is quite a cultural thing where there's that coercion if that's a cultural norm. I've also been able to maintain really great career success by having a defined market perspective and imperative, and being able to push and position myself based on that, so that I also am not required to do extreme amounts of after hours work or weekend work. And that is totally social work, all about positioning and understanding my power in situations. So the other thing in that has been in my favour is having incredibly good relationships with people. So that when you go to ask for things, people are more happy and more obliging and treat you with a greater level of respect. I feel like that's really helped as well.
I would maybe share to normalize the less appealing side of those perspectives. I really value work-life balance, and I think that if your work makes you miserable, you should find different work. But I always felt this sense of desperation. I was the sole income earner for my family and have 2 kids, and I needed this job and didn't have job security, and so felt very burdened by that feeling of, if I can't succeed, the cost of that is too great. And that was a very hard position to be in, and really drove me to have very poor work-life boundaries. They're a lot better now. I have job security. So when I got my most recent fellowship, I negotiated a continuing position with my university, which was just this enormous relief of, at least I know now there's a safety net if I don't get the next fellowship, if I don't find that next support. But I guess, yeah, I would just really emphasize that I have only felt the ability to hold those work-life boundaries with my privilege, with the privilege that came with a continuing position. And before that, it was just clawing, clutching at straws and trying to keep your head above water and never sure what's next and how to make the pieces fit together kind of thing. And that's been a very challenging aspect of this path. I don't think that it's the only one, but I just wanted to add that because both of you have spoken to really doing a great job at holding those boundaries. And I just want to own the fact that I've done a very terrible job at holding those boundaries throughout most of my career.
Miriam, I feel like what you're talking about, I definitely relate to from in all the universities work, that has been a common experience. And what I want us to challenge and set a new norm is, if we're going to have lived experience academics in this space, knowing everything that they've been through and all the things they need to do for themselves, that we need to challenge, when we're thinking about putting together our MRFF grants, are we going to expect our lived experience researchers to adhere to these boundaries, or are we going to give them things that are more productive? So it's interesting how that might play out, how hopefully bringing in and being conscious of lived experience might loosen some of that, because that's definitely real. I definitely see that.
Yeah, I definitely want to say, I want to normalize it from the sense that if other people are experiencing that, you're not alone. Not normalize it in the sense that it is okay to have that as our cultural norm and institutionally reinforced way of working. I think that's very damaging, and I agree. I've had 3 mental health care plans since getting my first fellowship. Like, I think, it's very stressful. You need a lot of support kind of environment, but yeah, just meant to raise it as not all of us can hold boundaries as effectively.
And that's where, we think about our lived experience academics. Maybe it is this, that we need to be getting ready to go into NGO pathways or into different things as well as thinking about our academic opportunities where there's more flexibility. Yeah, it's tough out there. I totally get it, Mary.
Yeah, I think everyone goes through intense periods like that where you are. I was certainly for at least 6 years. To build on Mary's point, is you go into survival mode, and that's a real thing. Recently, I've only been able to get some part-time job stability, and it's taken me at least a good 12 months, I think, to not be in the kind of fight or flight on your keyboard that you can get accustomed to. So, but that also, there's ebbs and flows in that. So if you feel like you can handle really intense periods where you've got to meet deadlines and try to make things work, and then have a more of a down period. I think everyone does that over time. It's when it's consistently sustained for long periods of time that you really do get burnout. And I guess I've also had a few of those close ones where I've just had to back right off, and having a family makes a difference. In the last 6 years, I've had 2 kids come along, and thankfully it's been roughly around about the same time when I've got some more job stability, but trying to manage that. I mean, there used to be no better thing for me than to get work done on the weekend. It's anxiety relieving, and you can feel like you start the next week ahead of the ball, ahead of the curve. And that hasn't happened for a long time. But you just got to let go of some of those things eventually.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there because we are coming up to time. But it's a very good message, I think, to finish on work-life balance, everybody. Thanks so much, Beck, for helping me with the Q&A. I know if we can hand over to Vicky now to close out the session, but thank you so much to each of you for your feedback and thoughts and comments. It's been really helpful.
I'll just add another thank you from myself as well. It's been a really, really fantastic session. For those questions that are still on Slido, we will keep a track of them, and they'll be archived so we can seek to answer some of those questions in future. If you're worried about your questions are not going anywhere, they will be answered.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It was really interesting to hear everyone's experiences. I am just going to quickly wrap up and just give some reminders about what's happening with the Alive. So we've got as we talked about, the seed funding or the capacity building funding scheme closes on Friday. So get your applications in. The Alive National Quarterly Forum is on September the 13th. So hopefully you've received that invitation, have booked that in. We've got World Mental Health Month coming up, so I'm sure there'll be lots of exciting things happening. And then there's 2 dates to save the dates for the annual symposium and e-networking events there in March next year. And before everyone rushes off, we've got a minute. If you could just fill in the poll to rate how you found today's event, to give us a sense for whether we're hitting the mark or whether we need to do something different. So Dana, have you got the link? That being put in the chat.
Yep, link should be in the chat.
Links in the chat. Yeah, thanks, Dana. So does anyone else have any final burning words that they'd like to say before we all log off for today and go get back onto writing our grants? No? Well, thank you all. It's been great to meet the panel, hear their experiences, and yeah, look forward to doing this again in a year, maybe, Dana.
Absolutely. We will be back next year. So thank you very much to all our panelists and to the Next Gen co-leads for organising this with me. And it was a really fantastic session. We really appreciate all your time, and it will be put together into our co-created guide and available as a resource. If you have anything to add, panelists, feel free to send me an email, and we will aim to respond to all the questions that were asked today in the guide as well. So thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.